This is just a quick video I had wanted to make. I had been really thinking about how to go about taking wide landscape aspect photos, as well as exaggeratedly tall photos without having to crop your images. My family and I sort of made it a tradition of going down to Universal Studios Orlando with our kids ever since they were little, usually once a year. When we go down, I occasionally like to grab photos of the different areas of the park, because they're so well themed. Some of them are almost like being on movie sets. Namely, being a huge Harry Potter fan, I like to take photos within the Wizarding World, and perhaps I'll drop a few in this video timeline. I wanted to explore the option of obtaining those sort of panoramic images in a different way that allowed me to preserve as much of the resolution as much as possible. My thought was in doing so by, and I'm sure you could guess this, using anamorphic lenses. Sorry, I have face only autofocus on, so it's not gonna focus on this. In case you're wondering, right now I'm shooting on the Canon C70. I'm just shooting in 4K. It's 4K DCI in XFAVC. I'm not shooting in RAW or anything because I don't want to have to color grade this later. But I'm shooting on a 35mm lens. The camera is about 3.5, 4 feet away from me. And this is the kind of image you get, right? This is your field of view on a 35mm on a Super 35 sensor. There's not a ton of me in the shot. There's not a lot of scene in the shot because, you know, this is the equivalent of, it's a 52 mil if you do the 1.6 crop factor, although Super 35 I think is closer to 1.5. But you're talking about basically a 50mm equivalent. That doesn't translate well to incorporating a lot of the environment. That's on APS-C or Super 35, so I would get a little bit more of the environment, but my subject wouldn't be quite as forward in the image. When you use something like an anamorphic lens, right, really all you're increasing is your horizontal field of view. You're not increasing your vertical field of view. And so you can be much more intentional about how much of the environment you incorporate and what aspects of the environment you incorporate, because you can either shift your focal length. So I actually have the Sirui, however you want to pronounce it, RF mount 35mm lens. I have a 50mm and I have the 75mm. So I have the whole kit. I started with the 35. My wife was generous enough for a Christmas gift to get me the other 2 lenses as part of the set. And I'll insert some little video clips of it, some B-roll. But it comes in a kit and you've got this nice case that comes with it for transport and for storage. And so that gave me the 50 and the 75. I have to say, I'm not doing obviously a lens review here. Out of the 3 lenses, the 50 is my favorite. You know, 50 is kind of a really natural on a full frame field of view perspective anyways. And then you sort of gain that width with the anamorphic aspect of it. Being a 2.9 on a 35mm with a minimum focus distance of, 0.9 meters, so like 3 feet, you don't get a lot of that bokeh quality from the 35 because you have to be so far from your subject. And with a 35mm on a full frame, that's a good amount of environment and distance that you need incorporated in that to really get those bokeh characteristics. You absolutely can, and I'll show you some photos that were taken on this later that kind of prove that. But without putting a diopter, if you want a subject like a person front and center that you're taking a photograph of this with, you kind of need a diopter to really get things thrown out of focus, unless the background's quite far away. My thought was, why don't I just use an anamorphic lens? Because essentially what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to desqueeze it. I'll do the same color grading process that I would normally do if I'm taking the photo in RAW. Aside from that, I might need to get rid of, depending on the characteristics of the lens or the photo, what I'm looking for in the photo, I might need to get a little vignetting cleaned up. I might need to, if there's a lot of chromatic aberration, you might have to deal with that in post, because obviously being manual lenses, it's not talking to the camera to do any of that digital correction. I might need to fix a little bit of the distortion if I don't want that characteristic in the lens. If I do, of course, the anamorphic is also going to give me some more qualities that you're not going to get out of a typical aspherical lens, right? Your aspherical lens isn't going to give you that stretched bokeh. It's not going to give you that swirly background, with some exceptions. You have your Helios lenses and things that give you some of the swirlier characteristics in the background. But a typical, clean Canon photo lens is not going to give you that stuff. So you can add more character with this, and then if you want to sort of clean that up in post, that'll add to your work, of course. I said, okay, well, we're going to Universal. There's all sorts of different stuff to photograph in these parks. Why don't I bring just two of the focal lengths? I'll do the 35 and the 75, even though the 50 is my favorite because in my opinion, it's the cleanest. It's really more my favorite for video and for full frame on video. And what I was looking to do is have a lens for things that I wanted a little bit closer up. I wanted you to see some of the backgrounds, or maybe I wanted some of the anamorphic characteristics to the lights in the backgrounds and things, but they weren't the focus. That was the 75. And then the 35 was, I want to incorporate as much of the environment as possible, because when it's a 1.6x squeeze, you're talking about like a 21 point something millimeter equivalent for your horizontal field of view, while maintaining a 35 millimeter vertical field of view. The other thing I wanted to try to do is a panoramic vertical photo. I didn't get a lot of those that turned out great, largely just because I was in a theme park. You got people coming in and out of the shots, and you've got your family with you who's like, hey, I don't want to wait 20 minutes for you to line up this perfect photo, get manual focus, make sure your exposure is perfect, and then snap your photo. Because I am very much an amateur photographer. And I would say amateur videographer as well. I don't have as many of the vertical, but I definitely see the potential for that if done well. I think the vertical would actually take more time than the horizontal. But I'll post some of those up here, and what you'll notice is that there's a really good amount of resolution still left in that image, despite it being so wide. And the reason for that is what you're doing is you're using the glass to essentially push and squeeze. That's why it's called desqueezing, right? Squeeze all that image into that normal field of view of your sort of 16:9 sensor, or your 3:2 if you have an open gate sensor or what have you. In this case, it's a 3:2 sensor because I'm doing photos. You're squeezing all that information onto that sensor, and then in post, you're digitally de-squeezing that. And so you're not losing resolution, although certainly an argument could be made that now you're sort of stretching the pixel. And so that's being, if it's digitally represented on a screen, you're shifting that resolution back over multiple pixels. So because everything's being done digitally, are you losing resolution? No, not fully. But are you preserving 100% of every single pixel? No, also not fully. Sorry for yet another tangent there. So I wanted to preserve as much of that, and you'll see that in these photos I was able to. In fact, the way I went about the sort of post-processing side of things, I'll do all my color grading in Lightroom, but Lightroom Mobile does not have a good way to de-squeeze a 1.6x lens. There is some stretching tools and all that, but it's really a pain in the butt, and you basically have to stretch it, export it, stretch that image again, export it, and so you are losing image quality at that point. So what I do is I typically do my color grading. I leave it as high resolution as I can on export. So I do a JPEG export full quality. So I bring it in as raw, CR3 file. I do all my color grading in Lightroom Mobile, export it as high 100% quality JPEG as I can, which may not be the right way to do it, but because I'm not changing any more color information, generally speaking, that's fine. All the resolution information should stay about the same. And then I'm gonna dump that into Davinci Resolve. I put it on a 6K timeline is how I did it, because even though the resolution, if you're going based on megapixels of a 30, I think there's a 32 point something megapixel camera, it's the original EOS R, so you can double check me on that. Putting it on a 6K anamorphic timeline with a 1.6 times anamorphic desqueeze already applied, and that pulls it out to that 6K anamorphic aspect ratio. And I will put a link below. I'm not even gonna bother saying it because I don't remember it off the top of my head, but there's this great chart online from these guys who essentially did the work of saying, okay, well, if your desqueeze is this, and you want this resolution, 1080p, 4K, 6K, 8K, 12K, what would your resolution settings be in Davinci Resolve or any other NLE? And I'll share those here because it's a huge help as a tool to figure out what should you set your timeline to preserve as much resolution as you can. But I used that, and I made a 6K anamorphic timeline, and I put my photos in there to maintain as much of the resolution as I could, and change the clip attributes so that it would automatically de-squeeze it. And then all you have to do is you have to export the current frame as a still, and it will export it as a full quality JPEG image with all of that resolution in it based on your 6K anamorphic aspect ratio you set for your timeline. And then I choose what I want to do with those. I either keep them to use digitally. I have an ultra wide, an LG ultra wide monitor. It's a 5K monitor that I can use them for as the background. And it is essentially a 21:9 aspect ratio. And when you're doing a 6K anamorphic with a 1.6x desqueeze, it's a 2.33 to 1, which, 21:9 is 2.33 to 1. And these end up being very, very close to that when you do a 3x2 sensor desqueeze into a 6K timeline, anamorphic timeline. So they fill the frame almost perfectly. And I tried to make sure that my subjects are quite center framed. One, because I don't want all the anamorphic characteristics applied directly to them. I want them to be nice and sharp and clean. And with anamorphic lenses, they usually soften at the edges and barrel distortion and all that. So I have them pretty centered to make sure I keep the subject as clean as possible. But on top of that, when it's on a monitor like my laptop monitor, because I'm hooking up to that bigger monitor using my M1 Max MacBook Pro. It's a 16-inch screen. It looks beautiful on my monitor, but I'm not getting that full width. And so I just basically have it set so that it's centered to fill the screen, but it doesn't stretch or squeeze it or anything. So on my native monitor, it's chopping off the sides, which for the picture I'm using, I think is great. And maybe I'll share that one in this one. It is my kids, so some people are iffy about posting their kids online. I kind of am. But it puts them front and center, which is really what I want to see. And then when I look up to my bigger monitor, I get this nice landscape panoramic, photo that includes them as well as the environment that they're in. And it's really cool. So it's a picture of them in front of the Hogwarts Express. And you've got the guy with the, train uniform on. I think he's supposed to be the conductor, but he's got the uniform on, and you see the Hogsmeade station sign and all that stuff. It's pretty cool. And so my purpose was to see, can I get these photos? Is it feasible to go to a theme park with anamorphic lenses only? Because I didn't bring any autofocus lenses. I didn't bring any spherical lenses other than my phone. Obviously, I can take photos with my phone. Because I didn't want to have a crutch to lean back to. Like, if I wasn't getting what I wanted, I just wanted to persist and say, can I do it? I'm going to just take the real photos from this trip on this guy, no matter how inconvenient it is, because I just want to see, is that even feasible? And here are my conclusions. You absolutely can. And some of them, in my opinion, came out great, especially because, as I said, I'm quite an amateur photographer. And to me, some of these photos looked beautiful. But there's a lot of things to do to get it there. Is it a feasible way to do it? It's feasible, maybe not practical. I did find that it took me a lot longer to get the photo I really wanted, partially because of the focus situation. It's definitely more difficult to ensure that you've got a solid, totally solid image at the end of the day when you have to get through a theme park with an anamorphic lens. You can't desqueeze it, so you don't have that preview. So you have to trust that you're framing things right based on what you can see in the viewfinder. Because you can see everything. It doesn't necessarily translate to how things are going to desqueeze. And so you have to trust that you're framing things accurately to how you're going to want them represented at the end of the image pipeline when you're done processing everything. And you have to trust that it's actually going to come out clean and sharp. And so when you're walking through a theme park and you're with your family and you've got two little kids who are like, Dad, I just want to go on the rides. What the heck? I don't want another photo. It's really hard to do it without autofocus. It's a pain in the butt. I'm going to post two images side by side that I took in Hogsmeade Village in the Harry Potter park on Islands of Adventure. And they were taken at totally different times of year. They were taken on two different cameras, although with close resolution in two different lenses. The first one I'll post is the one that I took with the 35mm Sirui anamorphic lens on my Canon EOS R, really reliant on shutter speed and those kind of things to control the lighting. So shutter speed, cranking down the t-stop. So I think most of those were shot on a t4 to t5.6 to diminish chromatic aberration, vignetting, all those kind of things, keep everything nice and sharp. Although I will say, pretty sharp at t2.9. The second photo I'm going to post, and by the time I'm talking about this part, it should already be up, is same area, not the same framing, because again, these weren't done with the intention of comparison. I just sort of decided to make a comparison later because I was like, wow, they look a lot different. Similar in terms of how I graded the image afterwards, and in post-production, I used the same software. Obviously, one of them didn't go through the Davinci Resolve pipeline because it was taken on a spherical lens. So the second image you're going to see is taken on my Canon EOS R5C with the Canon RF 15 to 35 f2.8 lens. And if I remember correctly, I might be wrong on this, but if I remember correctly, because I was kind of bouncing back and forth between video and photo, I did have, I believe, the Nisi True Color VND filter, so the 1 to 5 stop VND filter on it, which will change some of the characteristics of the sky, but not much. And it really, you know, they call it a true color. There's always a tiny bit of color shift, but I think it's pretty damn close to neutral color. But obviously the lenses are going to have a different color quality. One you'll notice is a little bit more green and warm than the other. I really didn't change the tint or the color balance on either of them. It was mostly like, did I want to bump up a little bit of saturation and bring up the shadows, or bring down the shadows, bring up the highlights, bring down the highlights, so create a little more contrast. But I didn't change the tint and things like that. I tried to get that right in photo. But you'll notice that the quality of the photo just looks totally different. The colors, how colors pop, how in and out of focus areas look. And despite losing the resolution on the one from the R5C, it really kept a lot of it. And when I looked at the actual pixel density on that, because on a Mac you can right click and you can look at the actual resolution of it, the resolution is still over 6K. I'm not comparing, you know, apples to apples here. It's a different lens. It's a different sensor. One is a higher resolution sensor on the R5C, and two, it's a newer sensor, so newer sensor technology in there. But both on Canon cameras, both using the Canon color science and edited in the same program in terms of the color. I was interested to see that I actually liked the one on the spherical lens more, but that was really for a couple images, and that was for the ones that tended to lean a little bit more cool. Whereas with the warmer images, I have a few that I took with, you know, with these guys that I just loved. I thought they came out really well. So you can definitely take, especially if you can take your time, your panoramic images with these anamorphic lenses, and they do come out well, but you got to take your time. You got to be willing to do a bit of work in post-production, and you've got to understand the limitations of using something like this. If you're going to be using it as your primary lens, you got to have some limitations as to what you can and can't, should and shouldn't do with it. I find that obviously taking a vertical photo with a aspherical lens, things just seem to come out a little cleaner because you don't have that fall off at the top and bottom of the image, and you can be a bit more intentional with how you're cropping things. So it was a fun experiment. I don't think I'll do it again. You know, maybe I would take the 35 with me just to get a really, really cool wide photo, but I would want to make sure that I had an aspherical lens. And for me, the 24 to 105 f4, you know, for vacation photos is great. It is technically weather sealed. It's autofocus, very reliable autofocus, a nice variability in terms of focal length. So 24 all the way to 105. It's got image stabilization on it. There's a lot of great things about that. But I think for most of my photos, they're probably going to be from my phone. It was a cool experiment. I got some great photos that I'm definitely going to keep and use as backgrounds on my widescreen monitor. And I would recommend, if you guys have never tried that, give it a try. See if you think it's feasible to photograph really with anamorphic lenses, or if these are something that really need to stick in the video world, right? Should we be using these for panoramic style photos, or do they just belong in the video world? And leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know, have you ever tried photographing with anamorphic lenses? I know there are people out there. I've even seen some wedding photographers do it, which is a risky take, but of course they have their aspherical lenses and spherical lenses with them. What are the situations you think it would work best in terms of photography instead of videography? Thanks for watching, guys. I know this was a really kind of a rant style video, and I was kind of all over the place, but I hope you got something out of this video. I hope you'll try doing some photography with an anamorphic lens. And if you do, I hope you share that with other people and let people know what your thoughts are on that. I'm always interested to hear what people in the community are doing. All right, I'll catch y'all later. Bye.